Hello, I'm Brent Best from Slobberbone and Brent Best. You're watching Time to Connect.
Hey, Brent Best. Thanks for
Hello,
taking the time to connect, man. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Appreciate you joining us. You're in Denton, I assume.
I am in Denton.
Yeah. I wore the Dan's T-shirt just in honor of you today. Do you have the same one on? Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Dan will be happy about that. So what Dan's has been around a long time. It's probably a pretty important place to you, I'm assuming.
It is.
Yeah. What does Dan's mean to you, if that's a question?
Well, the old Dan's, the old Dan's only lasted a few years, and then it was gone for a few years, and then it became Dan's Silverleaf on the other side of the square. But the old Dan's, when it first started, there was no clubs down around the cool old square in Denton. There wasn't much of anything going on except for thrift stores and stuff, which I loved, and a couple guitar stores, pawn shops. But so he sort of spearheaded all that, the development of downtown. But then he got run out by his own. He hoisted on his own petard. Then it was cool, and he couldn't afford it. So the spot he's been in for the last 20, 25 years is kind of. It was. I mean, we didn't play in the few years in between the old Dan's and the new, and this is back in the late '90s. We just didn't play shows in Denton, and it's our hometown. I mean, we might do a pickup show at the pizza joint and not tell anybody, but Dan's was the place. So it's very special, and having been working there as the production manager and sound guy the last few years, like I don't think I would have done that anywhere else. But he asked me, and like Dan's is different for sure. And like this past weekend was a perfect example. We had Jimmy Webb. It's a show that's been on the books for over 2 years, and then COVID hit. And I saw Jimmy Webb there years ago before I worked there. And so, there's not a lot of 200 plus venue bars that would, rent a grand piano for 3 days and hire someone to tune it and give me a day to tune the room so the piano doesn't feedback and get Jimmy Webb in. And then the next night, last night, because we had the piano, we had Scott Danbom and Will Johnson come and play. And I mean, how beautiful is that? Like, Scott's playing on the piano that Jimmy Webb played on. And we learned from the rental company that the last person they had rented it to was Paul McCartney. And it's just one of those things.
Wow.
Yeah, but I don't know where that show was, but what was more special other than Jimmy Webb, but to follow that up with, Will Johnson and Scott Danbom with a 7.5 foot grand piano in a tiny honky tonk bar like Dan's,
Yeah.
What other honky tonk bars have, made their living, not just with, country and alt country, but with people like Will and Scott and stuff. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, man. I saw that was coming up, and I really, really wanted to get up there to see that show, but didn't make it. But yeah, Dan's is definitely a special place for sure. So how long have you been in Denton? I know you were early 90s, or were you there before that?
I moved to Denton in the summer of 88.
Okay.
I was 17, about to be 18. I moved here to go to school, and I got a RTVF degree. I did mostly documentary film, and then promptly did nothing with it. I started a terribly named band, and just to try to get free beer and play a friend's party. And and then a couple of years later, we were making records and starting to tour. So
yeah, you and I have talked. You've mentioned that to me before in a previous conversation. I personally don't think it's such a bad name, but
in hindsight, from the exterior perspective, it's I get it. It's kind of sweet, but no, it's a terrible name. Come on. I mean, we knew it. We were, we had a dog and stuff. To us, the Slobberbone was just whatever the nasty thing that was chewing on. So it seemed very innocuous and sweet. But again, you know, we didn't start the band thinking we were going to do anything outside of, you know, playing our friend's party or maybe, you know, opening for someone at one of the beer joints or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's part of the lore now. So you know, I appreciate it from one perspective, and then the other perspective, I'm like, oh, damn.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, I was going to ask you later, but I'll go ahead and bring it up now, is the kind of mysterious, it's mysterious to me, maybe it's not mysterious, the Stephen King connection. And has he commented on the name of the band, as far as you know?
I never heard him comment specifically on the name, you know, I mean, when it first happened that he, we, you know, back then we were still touring all the time. I think we were probably later in the timeline knowing about that he knew anything about us than other people. Maybe somebody from the label had said something. I guess for a while he was writing a pop culture column for like Entertainment Weekly or something like that. It was like a last page kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it was, if I remember, he was like, I don't know why they would ask me to do this. I hate most pop culture. And then he's like, if I, you know, like musically, if I had to list 3 things, and he'd listed a song. But what was cool after that was in the next year or two, there was a novel I think he co-wrote with Peter Straub, Black House, and I didn't know this. Someone on tour told me that it mentioned us in a specific song several times, and that was neat. And then, and this was one of the coolest things. We were driving back from the West Coast, I think straight back from LA overnight, and I think we were somewhere outside of Albuquerque, and everyone was asleep, and I was gassing up, and Jess, our guitar player back then, had come inside to get something to drink, and he bought, and this will tell you how long, he bought like some books on cassettes. He's like, I'm sick of all the music we're listening to in the van. And it was some Stephen King short stories. I was like, I don't give a shit. He's the only one that was awake with me. And he puts the cassette in, and the first short story was a short, I think it was called The Stationary Bike. And within the first minute, it mentioned us, and it was like, holy cow, Stephen King really likes us.
He does, man. So you never over the years, you never talked to him, or he never reached out to you?
I've never talked to him. There was some show we did somewhere where we learned afterwards, according to whether it was true or not, that he was there. But I know that, you know, a lot of our friends' bands and similar band, like he was, you know, the Jayhawks and Marah and a lot of those bands, he was, you know, he did the same thing with them, and makes me feel good, you know, as a young reader. He was my young reading material when I was 12 or 13. Night Shift, that had all the short stories, that was a big thing for me, so it was kind of cool. And I remember years later, Larry Brown's probably my favorite author ever, and we become good friends. And
yeah,
I remember one night hanging out with Larry late and drinking, and Larry had written about us in some magazines, and would go on to write us into one of his books. But I remember one night, and I wasn't trying to, but, you know, telling him like how much it meant to me. And, you know, I was like, all everyone talks about in the press is, you know, Stephen King being into us. You know, and that didn't piss me off, but I was trying to tell Larry how much I was like, you know, it's such a bigger, and Larry just whipped me. He was like, no, because Stephen King was one of Larry's favorite authors. He's like, gotcha. No, dude, you take that and you run with it, man. Don't you ever tell people that you'd rather me be, you know, like, it was sweet.
Yeah, that was a tough loss when he died, man.
Oh man.
Well, I actually was going to ask you about books, but let's just bounce around here from topic to topic. Now that you brought up books, I'm curious what, I don't know about you, but my whole life, I've been a really avid reader. I was that kid who, you know, would get lost in a book and read for hours and forget to eat, and ended up teaching English and getting an English degree at one point. But lately, by lately, I mean the last 5 or 6 years, I'm finding it more and more difficult to sustain my attention reading a book, and I still do, but I have to force myself. And I'm sure that it's the effect of the culture, that we're all a little ADD now. As the culture's training us that we're supposed to be going on to some other clickbait after 5 minutes. Have you had any of that feeling at all, or are you still just as much a reader as you've always been?
I've had exactly that feeling, and I don't think I've talked about it with anyone other than my wife, who's a English and literature professor. I was someone who used to read 3 or 4 books at once. They were stacked on the nightstand or whatever, and man, but yeah, I think even before the pandemic, I think I got that way somewhere in the last 4 years. And, I try to, it's the same thing. I think when people, have asked me, like during shutdown, they're like, oh man, you must have wrote a lot of songs. I'm like, no, I haven't written any. And I felt bad about that because, I was staying at home. But regardless of, what anyone thinks about, I don't write from a place of, sadness or whatever. Like, I want to, maybe part of it's getting older, but I write when things are good. I might write about sad things, but I write when I feel good about sequestering and writing. And the last 5-6 years have been pretty nuts. And it hasn't stopped. And there's always that part of me that logs something in the back of my brain, or I write something down or whatever. But the old, where I just, something hits and then I stop everything and flesh it out and finish it, that hasn't been the case as much. And a lot of that's the same about reading, because reading and writing I realize now, were kind of inescapably linked. And it didn't mean that I read something and then wrote about it. It's just when you're in that mind frame, where you're reading all the time, it's the same mind frame as when you're writing all the time, whether you're putting it on a page or just it's in your head and building something or whatever. And I hate that. I think part of it is, like you said, modern media, online media. I hate that, I wake up and I pick up my phone or something just to make sure nothing super terrible has happened.
Yeah.
And a lot of times something pretty terrible has happened, like, and part of me wants to, I guess a 20 or 30-year younger me would go, no, man, you harness that and do something. But I'm not that person. I can't process it and make it, turn into something else. I was never that person, I don't know where I write from. So, but I want to wake up and feel like things are probably going to be okay, and then start writing, or even reading. I hate that. I think about it all the time now. I'm like, man, I should just turn off everything and just go back to reading all the time. But I don't know if that would work. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you're not done writing, are you? You're just taking a break, right?
No, I don't. I don't even feel like I'm taking a break. I mean, I am, because I'm not writing. But I just, years ago, I learned that the best stuff will write itself if I get the hell out of the way, and that was great for a few years, because I was in a good place, but that can become bad. It's like you still have to show up, and you gotta sit there and peck around, be it a guitar or a keyboard, a laptop or whatever. You gotta prove to the whatever the fates that you're willing to be the antenna. I think it's because I had so many years where things just kind of came all the time, and some of them I threw away. I've thrown away more good stuff, and had nothing to do with going, oh, this sucks. It's like, in my mind, I was like, oh, this is so strong. I'll wake up tomorrow and it'll still be there. And nope, it's not.
Yeah.
That my only lesson is, you know, when it, like Vic Chestnut said, when the bug hits, that's the time to scratch. So get it down, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't have any other responsibilities, you know, back then. I mean, longer than most, you know, into my late 30s, it was just me being a dickhead, you know.
The comedian Mitch Hedberg said, I write jokes for a living. And so if I'm laying in bed and I think of a good joke, but I don't feel like getting out of bed to write it down, I convince myself it's not that funny.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you about your songwriting. I wanted to ask you about certain songs. I won't keep you for too long. I've probably got more questions than we have time for, but let me ask you a couple things, like, let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about just you growing up and whatnot. Hopefully I won't get this wrong. You were born in Austin, is that right?
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was born in Austin, lived there till I was 6, I think. My dad worked for Texas Instruments. They were from Southern Illinois, and
Okay.
my dad happened to be preternaturally great at math, and got a couple engineering degrees and took the first job somewhere warmer than Illinois. And it was Texas Instruments back then in the 60s was basically either Austin or Dallas.
Gotcha.
And so they moved to Dallas. I believe I was probably conceived in Dallas, and then they moved him to Austin. And about 1976 or 77, they transferred him back up to Dallas. So I lived in the Plano, big sprawling suburb, which is way more sprawling now.
It is, man. Back in those days, it was like,
yeah, we still had ranches and cattle and stuff.
Yeah.
And then this would have been about 77, and then we moved to Lucas, which is kind of east of Plano, east of Allen, south of McKinney, and it's very rural. And it's because my folks had grown up on farms and stuff. And when I look back, I think of how genius that was, because we had all the cultural benefits of still being, you know, close to DFW. But you know, I grew up fishing and riding my motorcycle and stuff like that.
Right on. And what kind of stuff were you listening to when you were a kid? What were some of the bands or musicians that you remember really influencing you when you were young?
Well, how young do you want to go back? Like, that's the thing. You know, the other night with Jimmy Webb, and I remember talking about it. I mean, even in Austin, and I can remember things from when I was like barely 3, and like for years, my parents are like I can remember something specifically and ask them about it, and like, how do you remember that? You know, but Austin in the early 70s, you know, my dad had this old Chevy Nova with AM radio, but AM radio in Austin in the early mid 70s was amazing. So, you know, Jimmy Webb, I remember hearing, well, it was Glenn Campbell's version, of course, but Wichita Lineman from a young age. There were 2 songs when I was like, and I started kindergarten when I was like 4. There were 2 songs that I remember, and they would just make me bawl. And it was Wichita Lineman and Jolene by Dolly Parton. But that radio back then in Austin, you know, it was probably a lot of Michael Martin Murphy and all this stuff, but you might hear, it was AM radio at a time when FM had already started, and FM could do whatever they want. So these AM stations in Austin that might be country were pretty much doing whatever they want to. And, you know, this isn't something I recognized, of course, back then as a child, but when I look back, you know, there was a lot of cool stuff. But, you know, Wichita Lineman or Jolene would make me bawl, and my dad would go, "You want me to turn this off?" I was like, "No, of course not." No.
Yeah.
So from a young age, it was, and my dad didn't listen to a lot of, you know, neither of my folks listened to rock and roll unless it was, you know, like stuff that they heard when they were teenagers, like Chubby Checker or stuff like that. But they didn't have those records or stuff. So my dad, he liked, by the time he was there in the early 70s, he liked the Outlaw stuff, Willie and Waylon. I remember him having that Outlaws record and a couple of Willie records, and that was a big deal to me. because if your dad likes it, it didn't seem like my dad was an engineer. It didn't seem like he liked a lot of music or stuff like that, but he did. He loved that stuff, so that was a big deal to me because music to me from a young age was. My mom had show records like
Broadway show stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that because it was weird, man. It was I had to get way older before I realized, the sort of Eastern tunings and stuff. But If I Was a Rich Man is an insanely atomic song,
Yeah, it is.
But as we moved up. I had an older brother who was 4 years older than me, so by the time I was 8 or 9, you're kind of riding on his coattails, and by the time he was a teenager, like. He was into metal, and metal hadn't gotten super hair metally and bad yet. So, lots of Judas Priest and stuff like that. And so, of course, I loved it. I think by the time I was about 11, Rush was the one I glommed onto because it just seemed, I grew up in a small town, but it had big town radio. So a lot of Van Halen and AC/DC and stuff, which I liked. But Rush seemed weirder to me.
Yeah.
And someone cool in school might tell you that Rush wasn't cool. So I was like, well, it was my alternative before I found punk rock or post punk or whatever,
Yeah.
And to this day, I still take shit for it and I love it. I never bought a Rush record after, I don't know, 1987 or something. But it kind of made me want to go back. I was like, fuckers,
You bet.
Everyone wants to be. And then some of those same people years later, then Rush kind of became cool. And I remember them going, so where should I start? And I'm like,
yeah, there you go.
You lost it, man. But what I realized was, the reason I loved Redheaded Stranger as a 6-year-old so much, and it took me, into my 20s or 30s to realize, is the same reason I loved 2112 by Rush. It was storytelling.
Yeah.
And then you might, the music, I want to believe, the music is first, but it becomes all one thing, So years later as a writer, I realized, like we were talking about earlier, the best stuff will write itself if you get out of the way, but also the best stuff will write itself. The story and the music will write itself at the same time because it's all doing one thing. By the time I was mid-teens or whatever, I was getting into early REM was a big thing for me, and I loved lots of stuff, Waterboys and a lot of stuff lots of people like, but I was drawn to Jason Scorchers and Long Riders and stuff because I was like, here's country stuff that's punk too, so
Beat Farmers.
Oh yeah, man. And, stuff that had stories attached.
I'll never forget Country Dick, Montana was walking around in a crowd. My wife and I think it was a South by Southwest time, and I don't remember the venue, but as I recall, it was Beat Farmers, New Duncan Imperials, and Mojo Nixon.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and Beat Farmers had already played, and Country Dick was walking around with a pitcher of beer and drink. He was a mountain of a man, and he had that pitcher of beer and was drinking it like he was drinking out of a mug. And my wife walked up to him and said, "Hey, Country Dick, give me a drink of that beer." And he kind of leaned back and looked at her and he said, "You like psychedelics?"
Did she drink it?
Yeah. I don't think there were psychedelics in it. It was just more of a, it was Country Dick being Country Dick. But one thing I'm wondering about is what about Bob Dylan, and is he somebody? I'm sure he had some kind of influence on you. He had an influence on all of us who try to write songs. But how do you think of him? Did you catch up later and or were you there early with him, or how do you feel about Dylan?
I did catch up a little later, like I was, I don't think I had a cassette player till I was 12 or 13 or something. So, the radio was it. But, you would, the time when I was a kid in the 70s too, it could be confused if your parents didn't have rock records or whatever. By the 70s, it could be confusing. Like I mean, same thing with the Beatles for me. Like I came backwards to Beatles because, I could get up any day and hear Come Together on the radio, but it was Aerosmith doing Come Together.
Yeah.
And so when I would hear the Beatles version, I'm like, what is this? And I could ask my older brother and he goes, I don't know, he's listening to Judas Priest or something. But it was infinitely interesting to me. One of the big things was like Beatles wise, when we first moved to Lucas out in the country, which is like Mayberry, and I went to a tiny school that only went to 6th grade. This was, smack dab in the middle of the disco period and stuff. So, the version of like I was hearing the Bee Gees doing the Beatles from that terrible movie, which is awesome. I've gone back and watched it, the Sgt. Pepper's thing. But I was also way before I had any musical aspirations. From a very young age, I wanted to be Steve Martin, to the fact that it got me in trouble that career day in 3rd or 4th grade. Like, first of all, why are you having a career day in 3rd or 4th grade? They're 4th graders. But the teacher goes, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I want to be Steve Martin. She goes, so you want to be a stand-up comedian? I was like, no, I want to be Steve Martin. And she ended up calling home. Like, I remember it during dinner time, and back then, answer the phone at dinner. My dad's already pissed. It's dinner time. I need to talk to you about yourself. He's like, what? Yeah. Oh, no, he loves Steve Martin. Okay, we'll talk to you later. But Steve Martin doing, Maxwell's Silver Hammer or what? So that was a confusing time. But I know I heard a lot of Dylan on the radio, on album rock radio before it, but it was whatever was that time period. That it's fun for me to go back and sort of piece it together, because some of it I didn't know was Dylan or what until I got older,
Yeah.
And then about the age of, like 14, 15, I was already into a lot of like post-punk or things around that. I think when I was 16, there was a friend of mine, this girl, and she wanted to go see the New Bohemians that weren't signed yet or whatever. So I drove her down to Dallas. I think it was at the Hard Rock Cafe. And Peter Case opened, who I hadn't heard of, and it's just him and a guitar.
Yeah.
And it blew me away. And the next day I went and found, he just put out his first solo record on Geffen. And that record, me and my friend Kevin Kirby, who started out right, that record became the next year of our life, just listening to it. And I've told people this before, like that was our arrow back to Dylan. He was kind of our Dylan for, kids who didn't have rock and roll parents or whatever. And then as the Dylan crept back in, the recognition of all the stuff I'd heard for years, it all, in some ways I'm kind of happy because it all sort of lockstepped and was more of a solid foundation, And it's funny, years later I played with Peter and talked to him about it. He's like, yeah, man, that's nuts, man. I'm no, I was like, but you are,
Oh, he was, yeah.
Or whatever.
What year would that have been, Brent, that you got turned
I
on to
first
Peter
saw
Case?
him?
Yeah.
Probably 1986. First year I was driving, so I was 16 and I could get into Hard Rock Cafe because it wasn't, an actual club.
I'm pretty
sure.
And
I remember telling him that years later. I was playing. He's like, "Oh man, I didn't think anyone cool was at that show." I was like, "Well, I wasn't cool. I was 16. It was something his label sent him to do."
I'm pretty sure I was at that show, and I was at that time. Was it KNON? Was it already in? I think it was already happening then.
Oh yeah,
and I used to go down and just hang out at the station. And for example, when Billy Bragg was in town and on, I went down there and hung out with them. It was, it was easy to do back then. Not that many people were aware. And Peter Case was there, and I met him there at the station and watched him play a couple songs there and was blown away by him.
Were you a Dallas guy?
Yeah. Well,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was born in Leavenworth, Kansas, and my standard line is no, my mom was not in prison. But I've been in Texas since my high school years, and
Where'd you go to high school?
Falls Church, Virginia. But in my senior year of high school, my family moved to Waco, Texas.
Ah,
And I finished high school in Waco, got out of there as fast as I could, and went to Denton. And I was in Denton collecting degrees from 74 when I graduated high school until 95 when I moved to Austin.
you got all the degrees.
I got several. Yeah, I kind of got lost in Denton, as a lot of people do. But let's see, I've lost my train of thought there. But yeah, I kind of moved back and forth between Denton and Dallas for years.
What a cool place to get lost in, though, like
Yeah.
mid 70s to 80s or whatever, like
Yeah,
I
it was
still,
great.
it took, when you're young and you're there, and I didn't really do anything until I got done with college, but you're starting to be, you were all the dudes like tonight, like hanging out with Jeffrey Barnes for Brave Combo, all those guys that were there, like when you're younger, you're like, yeah, I don't care about that. But man, now I just wish I was old enough to be there in the 70s, like.
Yeah, but man, Denton in the 90s, especially early 90s, was pretty darn cool.
It was great.
When
I
Rick's was going, and bands
we
like
wouldn't
Three on a
exist.
Hill,
Oh,
Three on a
yeah.
Hill, and Tripping Daisy and Billy Goat. Good God,
Yeah.
man.
man.
And I've told you that I thought was one of your first shows, but it was at the White Pizza Place, so it probably wasn't one of the first ones. But and I hope I'm not insulting you in any way when I say this, but I've always kind of associated you, Slobberbone, with Uncle Tupelo.
What's cool is that, so I remember finding up, I think I had, was already writing songs. I wasn't done with college yet. I was already writing songs, had one guitar, had this big Yamaha 12 string that the action was so high on, you could drive a truck through it, and it was so hard to play. and touch an electric guitar. But I'd been writing, my friend Kevin Kirby and I that had grown up together, he went to school in Arkansas and ended up getting married, and I came to Denton. But we kind of set ourselves on a path. We were writing these sort of songs and stuff. And then, so he didn't do that great in school. He had joined some local band up there, and it was kind of jammy or whatever. But, the whole thing was we'd always get back together or whatever. And where we came from, and even in Denton at the time, there wasn't anything like, Denton was awesome. There's a lot of, kind of the white boy funk stuff because of the jazz school, but a lot of, like, Brutal Juice was the North Star for a lot of us.
Yeah.
It had, just in terms of getting in a club and bludgeoning people, that was it. But I was writing these tunes and stuff. I remember, I think it was, man, like being in the library and reading a Rolling Stone. They used to have that little column like Fresh Faces or something. I don't know what it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And there was these three guys that, I think Farrar barely had his eyes open, looked drunk. I was like, those people look like me.
Yeah.
And it was before the first record had come out. And I remember, you remember Option magazine?
I don't.
Such a great music magazine. Like, it was a lot of underground, like the last third of the magazine was just record reviews and stuff of, you got to remember back then, even in the late 80s, early 90s, it was pre-internet, and there wasn't a lot of great stuff. Like, there were the punk mags and whatever, but so I found Option. I remember driving to a record store in like East Dallas and buying that magazine just to get the address for, I think it was Rockville Records, so that I could order their first record, because it wasn't in any stores or whatever, on Rockville Records or whatever. And just from reading this blurb, I was like, well, that sounds kind of like what, I'm doing. And I got it, I think it's the first record I bought on CD. And I didn't have a CD player, but my older brother did, and I was living with him in a house in college. So I got No Depression. It had just come out. And I remember waiting for my brother to leave because I didn't want his commentary or anything. And just going, son of a bitch, this is, what with electric guitars and shit. And it already checked the boxes. I was already into, the Mats and Husker Du and shit. I was like, fuck.
How about Neil Young?
These fuckers already did what I was,
Yeah. Were you also into Neil Young at the time?
Oh yeah. Oh, that Neil Young was already, man. By the time, I was into Neil probably before I really discovered Dylan, but the Crazy Horse shit for me was the thing. And
I can see that.
Like my freshman year or sophomore year of college was when Ragged Glory came out, and somehow I scored a second row ticket. And to me, that was the shit. Like, I was never like a guitar player. To me, it was about big notes, and Crazy Horse is that, And I'll never forget, it was at Reunion Arena in Dallas, and they put a giant curtain across the middle of Reunion Arena, so it was just like a horseshoe.
Yeah, I remember that.
That show, I think they had two open. Social Distortion was first band, and then it was Sonic Youth. And I remember getting it. Of course, I'm sitting up in the nosebleeds because that's all I could afford, and all the hippies down front, the rich old Neil Young hippies, all during Sonic Youth, they're just pissed. They're like,
they don't get it.
Finish the song, you can hear like boos and shit. And I'll never forget, like, Neil Young, Crazy Horse came out. Neil Young, he's like, what y'all think of Sonic Youth? And you're boo, boo. He's like, yeah, if you didn't like that, you could have hate this. In the first, like 12, 15 minutes, it's just feedback and shit. And several years later, you get that Weld record and Arc, where one record is all feedback. I was like, oh, motherfucker. So that was a huge thing to me. Like, I didn't have, as much as I love, like Jason Scorch and all this, there was no, when we were getting going, there was no notion of whatever alternative country or No Depression or any of that shit. To me, it was all rock and roll. But and punk, it was like, growing up in Texas and liking what I liked, I love the Clash. What's more punk than doing something kind of countryish but loud? And with me, I wasn't a good player. I'm not going to do some, badass Jerry Reed chicken picking. But I even when I tried to write like bands I loved, like, Buffalo Tom or something, I couldn't. I could only write these kind of countryish story songs. So we just made them loud and fast, So Uncle Tupelo, once I found them, I was like, oh, they're doing that too.
Same thing. Yeah.
I got to see them early on several times before it kind of blew up. There was a while when I was in a band called Adam's Farm with Matt and Mark.
That's right. Yeah.
Slobberbone had already started, and I was in another band with Tony, who would become the drummer in Slobberbone. But after about a year or so, like, I was like, it was great. I had already liked Adam's Farm and stuff, but I was like, man, I gotta quit to do my own thing. And with like maybe a year later, I remember they got to open for Tupelo on the Anodyne tour at Tree. So they're like, would you just come back and do this one show with us? Because it was, it was that moment where a lot of people that were either jangly or Dinosaur Jr. or whatever was like, oh, there's this thing,
Yeah.
So when I look back, like, I feel good. Like, we were already kind of there, but I can't diminish how good it felt to know that there was already this entity that was doing it.
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah. Adam's Farm, were you in that band before Matt joined?
No.
Okay.
In fact,
did you know Will Saws? Who was the drummer before Matt in that band?
I didn't.
Okay.
It was
Well,
Matt and Mark and oh, I feel terrible. I'm forgetting his name, but there was like a 3-day kind of festival thing that was, I think it was an Amnesty International Festival. It was at all these clubs around Fry Street, and Matt and Mark came, and we had only been a band for a little while, and we weren't that great. So they sat right down front, and then afterwards they were like, "We really want you to play in this band." So and it was great fun, and I mean they're lifelong friends. So
absolutely. Hey, I want to ask you a little bit about your songwriting, and let me get into it by asking you a question I've been asking everyone else that I've been talking to in this series. And I'm just going to choose Neil Young. You choose anyone who you kind of have reverence for. That, imagine if you were playing a solo gig at Dan's and someone like Neil Young walked in and stood right in front of you. Whoever that person would be, that you would go, "Oh shit," and that you would be a little intimidated by, perhaps, right? Would that Neil Young qualify?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
In
So
fact, I've been in a room with him, and and this has happened a few times with different people, but with Neil, and my lawyer was there, and he's like, he's like, "I've done stuff. Let me introduce you." And I was like, "Nope." He's like, "Why not? Like, you're art." And I was like, "Because it's like staring in the sun, you know." And I was probably,
Wow.
I was probably drunk and stuff, and just
Yeah.
felt like what am I gonna say to him that, like,
Yeah.
so,
Well, there's also maybe a little bit of that thing of, no, let me just, I don't want to disappoint, I don't want to be disappointed. Let me just continue to just revere him from afar. But imagine Neil shows up at your door tonight and knocks on the door and says, "Hey man, I hear you're a songwriter. Play me one of your songs." What would you play him?
oh gosh. I guess I'd play him. See, that's the thing, because I'm gonna be trying to read him. I'm like, what do you? I'll be like, "Do you want rock, or do you?"
Yeah.
Which is a terrible way to be. I'd probably play him Aunt Ramona or Robert Cole or something like that. All that stuff happened after I had, reached a point where I was like, I don't have to write for this band. Like, what happens if I just write for myself? So, and a lot of people responded to those songs, and those songs didn't have the avenue that the band had, being on a label, big label and stuff, and just going in rooms and playing those songs, and people who've never met you before coming up and telling you, like,
Yeah,
this reminds me of my childhood and my mother or something. So I guess
well,
I'd do something like that.
if I got to make that choice for you, it would be Robert Cole. That man, I wanted to ask you about that song, because that song really pierces me, and I'm not quite sure I understand why. I mean, first of all, it's just a great melody, and the way you kind of slow down going into the chorus has it. I don't know. There's an emotional something that happens there that's really strong. But the song reminds me a little bit of most of the songs that I really admire, which is, it's clearly a story song, but it's not a clear, Tom T. Hall kind of clear narrative. I just wonder, I'm not gonna sit here and ask you, will you analyze your own song and tell us what it means? But maybe a little bit. And I think I get a lot of what's going on there, and I don't think it's important that we have a clear narrative. But I'll just ask you, anything you want to say about that song?
Well, there was a point, even with Slobberbone, that I learned, from Slobberbone Live was about hitting you over the head, but I wanted these songs where, we pull it back, and that's the contrast, So, so I say that as if I was masterminding this, but I wasn't. Like, I wrote, these kind of rock songs, and then the stuff that I wrote more easily was stuff like, even going back to the second record, like Little Sister, that was this very kind of folky or whatever story song. But I learned from early on with that song, like we were, by the second record, and we toured the second record for 3 years before we made another record. But it was enough to where the people that was into us coming out, like that was a song people asked about a lot, and they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry about your sister," and I'm like, "I don't have a sister."
Right, yeah.
But I learned that, the songs that people respond to a good story song, but it doesn't mean they respond. You don't have to tell them everything. You don't have to wrap it up or whatever.
Yeah.
In my mind, the story songs weren't so much about a narrative as much as they were about, building a scene. And then if this happens or what, let the characters kind of, and so for years, people were like, well, what happens at the end of that? And, depending on that, I was like, well, what do you think happens? And they were like, no, screw that. Tell me what happens.
You tell me. Yeah.
Honestly, I didn't go farther than that when I wrote it, because if something sits right, you let it marinate in its own juices or whatever. I think years later, by the time Slobberbone had quit touring and shut down, broke up for a while, like all I wanted to do, I didn't want to think about how the band got to do this or whatever. And I was living in this old kind of farmhouse out in the country, and had this big weirdly shaped kitchen that just sounded good. And for the first time in a long time, I could just walk around with acoustic guitar and play and sing like I used to do when I was younger. And things just come out, and then you go with it. I had remembered years before when Will had first moved back to Denton, and we had become friends. And I think I talk about it in what I wrote. I was always enamored with Will's writing, because, he could have a song that's a minute and 20 seconds long, and it just blows me away. It feels like a 4-minute song, and he's maybe saying 4 lines, and there's no real. And I was so OCD. I was like, no, a song has to be this and this, or, the lyrics have to be this and this. But I remember Will like calling me or something. I'm like, why are you calling? What are you doing? He's like, I'm just, and this was many, many years ago, before maybe even our second record. He's like, I'm just driving around listening to I Can Tell Your Love Is Waning, and wondering how somebody writes something like this. Like, did you know it was going to end this way? I was like, no, I just write a line in the next line. So that made me realize early on, like, you're not going to do it better than the universe if you just stay out of the way or whatever, not to sound too whatever.
Yeah.
So Robert Cole was one of those songs, and I'd moved out to that house, and I think it's the first thing. I was outside of town about 20 minutes. It was harder. Had to be careful. My band was at the time was done, and I'd be careful about coming in town and going to the bar, because probably gonna get drunk, and I'm gonna drive out all that way and stuff. So I was spending more time at home, and that one came about like the old ones do. It was one line after the other. It's musically, it's pretty simple, but that led to. I didn't know what to do at the time. It was about the time that I was writing stuff or the Drams were coming together or whatever. And then a couple of months later, my buddy Tim Lee from the Windbreakers called, and he was putting together the tribute record for Larry Brown after Larry had passed away. And I was like, he's like, do you have anything for this? I was like, oh my God, I do. Like, and and he was instantly, he's like, did you write this based around a Larry story? I was like, no, it just, So the best stuff still will just happen if you get the hell out of the way. It's just the older I get, it's harder to. I know all my own tricks, so it's harder to trick myself.
Well, man, again, I like a lot of your songs very much, but that one, for some reason, really touches me. And I think anyone watching this or listening to it probably already knows your work, but if they don't, it wouldn't be a bad song to start with to find out about Brent Best's songs.
I'm
But
fine with it.
let me, if I may, let's kind of wrap up here. And one of the things I've sort of promised in this series, I'm one who thinks that podcasts and interview shows a lot of them are entirely too long. So I've sort of promised that these are going to be less than an hour. So let's kind of start moving towards a conclusion. And who knows, maybe I can get you on later for part 2. But let me, if I can, to take us kind of home, just ask you a few rapid fire questions, and just see what comes up. And if you don't want to answer or don't have an answer, that's fine. What are you most proud of?
Oh gosh. My friends and my family, I spent a lot of time gone. It's the thing I wanted to do, was be on tour all the time. And I did that for a very long time. And I came back home to Denton, and all those friends and people were still there. I mean, that's how I met my wife. And that's maintaining those relationships is something to be proud of.
Beautiful. What pisses you off?
Oh God. Yeah. That's
a lot of things.
well,
right?
I try to be someone who's zen and keeps, but I mean, in this day and age, whatever pisses you off probably is pissing me off.
You know what Patterson's answer to that question was?
No.
2020.
Good start. Yeah.
Let's see if this is a really hard question, and it's okay if nothing comes to mind, but who knows, something might. The cliche question: if you're on a deserted island and you can bring one album, presumably you have a record player, but you can bring one album. What is that album?
I've been asked this before, so I always just go with something like, there's no way I can think of something that's going to encompass my life. So whatever at that moment, I was like, I don't know, the Cars, Candy-O. Like, if I'm on a deserted island, maybe you're trying to be existential. I'm like, oh, I should have brought this album. I'm like, no, I want something that reminds me of when I was 14 or something.
Good. Yeah. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Candy-O.
Yeah. What do you like most about Denton?
The stuff I love most about Denton, sadly, is kind of eroding away, but you can still see it. When I first moved here in '88, it was cowboys and lesbians, and that in a tiny town, and that was I didn't recognize it as such at the time, but like there was some I don't know, concrete walled club that only lasted a year where I could see cool stuff and then get up the next day and go to an old school cafe with the little mini jukeboxes on the table, Joe's Diner,
Joe's, yeah.
Common Joe's. And it was the pawn shops with cheap guitars and stuff. So I think even though a lot of that's gone, I think I still hold on to that.
Sure.
But mostly what I love about Denton are the friends and the people who are still here with me hanging out.
Recycled books still there on the square?
Oh my gosh, yeah. And
such a great, man.
All the stuff we've lost, that's major real estate. The fact that they're still there is just wonderful.
Fantastic.
I always told people it was a joke, but it was true. My favorite bathroom in Denton for years was recycled books. You're walking around, you go down into the basement and then come back up.
Yeah.
And go down in this hall, and the window would always be open. And when you go in the bathroom, you're suddenly, 2.5 stories off the street from where you walked in. There's a breeze, and you got endless reading material. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. That's
they
hilarious.
moved the bathroom. That's not there anymore, but
that's hilarious. Okay, got a really profound one. What happens when we die?
When you die or when I die? I don't know.
I mean, do you have any concept, or do you think about it all, afterlife, or is there such a thing, or do we?
I have to look. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church and stuff with parents who I learned later on were, these Midwestern Baptist, which turns out wasn't near as weird or strict or whatever. But from a young age, even back then, I was like, really? You know, when they're giving you these absolutes, I was like, that sounds kind of stupid. So in my mind, I don't have any, you know, and I'm a storyteller and a story reader. So, you know, my dad was an engineer, and so I'm just as comfortable that we're just, you know, worm food or whatever. But in my mind, the good story is it's not the biblical, you know, heaven and hell. We all just go back to where we started. The really good story to me is that we all know each other, not just you or me or my wife and me, but everybody. And that, you know, we built this game, and that we're like, okay, you got to do the game. We're omnipresent where we come from, but we built this game like, okay, you go down, but you don't get to pick where you start or where you end, and you'll have no knowledge that we all came from this thing. And then when you're done, whenever it is you die or we die and you come back, we all get to make fun of you because of how you acted, not knowing that you were these omnipresent beings. That's my
Man, that's a short story right there.
well.
That's a short
I mean,
story.
it's the only thing that makes sense on some days to me.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, that's
'cause
very
it's so
cool.
ludicrous.
Very
And
cool.
it gets more ludicrous the longer we stay around.
Yeah. I sometimes feel that. I sometimes feel, are we like
Yeah,
in a, you know, in a lab someplace that someone's
it's the
watching us?
simulation. Yeah. And now
Okay.
that there's physicists going, no, we really think it's
Yeah.
a simulation. Like,
Yeah.
God damn it, I knew it.
Yeah. All right, man. Last question. When you are dead and gone, when you are worm food or back in the universal hive mind or wherever it is, what do you hope people say about you?
Oh shit, I don't know. Man, I guess the same thing I hope people say about me when I'm alive. They're like, yeah, you know, he's has moments, but he's not a complete asshole. You know, I'm just as much, you know, the person you talk to at a gas station or whatever. Like, it's nice when someone goes, hey, that guy's pretty sweet, you know. So
Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
I don't need a big litany of you know, of
Accolades.
accolades. I just, you know.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Hey, man, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to connect. And maybe we can do a part 2 of this at some point.
Sure, let me know. I appreciate it. Sorry I was late.
Right on,
Appreciate
man. Thank you so much.
it.